Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku could see every way he might die in the next hour? Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in the Heights Alliance dormitory always tasted different in the morning. It was a unique blend of yesterday's lingering dinner. Kaminari had tried to make takoyaki again, with predictably explosive results, and the clean, sterile scent of Ida's obsessive pre-dawn polishing of the common room furniture. For Izuku Midoriya, it was the smell of a fragile, hard-won piece. A normal life, or the closest approximation a class of fledgling heroes in training could manage. He laced up his red sneakers, the worn fabric a familiar comfort against his ankles. His movements were precise, economical, a habit born from countless hours of training and the constant, low-level thrum of one for all simmering just beneath his skin. The power was a living thing inside him now, no longer a wild beast threatening to shatter his bones with every flex. Post-Kamino, post-All Might's retirement, every ounce of progress felt both like a monumental victory and a terrifyingly inadequate step on an impossibly long road. Midoriya! Good morning! Tenya Ida's voice boomed from the doorway, his arm chopping the air in a crisp salute. He was already in his school uniform, tie perfectly knotted, glasses gleaming. I trust you slept well? Adequate rest is paramount for optimal performance in today's practical exercises. Izuku offered a tired but genuine smile. Morning, Ida. I slept okay. A little keyed up for today, I guess. Understandable. Ida nodded, adjusting his glasses. A return to the unforeseen simulation joint is a significant milestone for our class. It represents our growth, our ability to face a location of past trauma and demonstrate our enhanced capabilities. From the kitchen, Ochako Uraraka floated by, a piece of toast hovering near her mouth. She beamed at them, her cheeks still round with a hint of sleepiness. He means we get to blow stuff up in a safe space again. Morning, Deku! Morning, Uraraka! Izuku chuckled. Her simple, straightforward cheer was a grounding force, a reminder of why he was doing this. For them. For everyone. The bus ride to the USJ was a cacophony of familiar sounds. Kaminari and Ciro were arguing with Mineta about the strategic advantages of different female pro-heroes' costumes, a debate that earned them a sharp jab from Jiro's earphone jacks. Tsuyu Ajiri offered a quiet, logical counterpoint that left Mineta sputtering. Todoroki sat by the window, a silent portrait of ice and fire, watching the city blur past. And then there was Bakugo. Katsuki Bakugo sat several rows ahead, slouched in his seat, staring out the opposite window. He wasn't yelling or snarling, not yet. It was a quiet, simmering anger that seemed to radiate from him like heat off asphalt. Their relationship, if one could call it that, had shifted into a strange, unspoken territory since their late-night battle at Ground Beta. There was a truce, a fragile understanding built on secrets and shared burdens. Bakugo knew about One for All, and Izuku knew that beneath the explosive rage was a crushing weight of guilt over All Might's fall. They were rivals, bound by a fate neither of them had asked for. Izuku found his own gaze drifting out the window, his hand unconsciously clenching and unclenching. The USJ. The last time they were there, they were children playing dress-up. They'd been ambushed by the League of Villains, scattered, terrified. Aizawa-sensei had nearly been killed. All Might had fought the Nomu. Izuku had shattered his body just to make a ripple in the water. But we're different now, he told himself, the thought a well-worn mantra. I'm different. He had shoot style. He could control 20% of One for All, with momentary bursts of higher power. He wasn't the same crying kid who broke himself with every punch. He was Deku, the hero in training. He had to be. The colossal dome of the USJ loomed into view, its glass panels glinting in the morning sun. A shiver, unwelcome and cold, traced a path down his spine. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was memory, the echo of past pain. He pushed it down. Ida was right. This was a chance to prove how far they'd come. 13 and Aizawa-sensei were waiting for them at the entrance, standing side by side like a strange sci-fi movie poster. Aizawa's eyes, tired and red-rimmed as always, swept over them with an intensity that belied his slouched posture. All right, settle down. he said, his voice a low drone that still managed to cut through their chatter. You all know where we are. Don't let it get to your heads. This isn't about confronting your past traumas. It's about applying your skills. 13 and I have set up a new scenario in the collapse zone. He gestured towards the massive, rubble-strewn area of the facility. It looked even more chaotic than Izuku remembered, a mangled cityscape of shattered concrete, twisted steel beams, and overturned vehicles. The scenario is simple, Aizawa continued. A high-intensity earthquake, followed by a villain attack that further destabilized the structures. There are 20 rescue dummies and 5 critical objectives scattered throughout the zone. The dummies are equipped with sensors that measure timeliness and handling. Rough treatment will cost you points. The critical objectives are things like a leaking gas main, or an unstable power transformer that need to be secured. Your goal is to rescue and secure as much as you can before the timer runs out. Teamwork is encouraged, but you will be graded individually. 13 stepped forward, their suit whirring softly. Remember the primary purpose of your quirks in a disaster scenario. It is not for combat, but for saving lives. Your power should be a tool for rescue, for clearing paths, for protecting the vulnerable. Think creatively. Think safely. Begin. A heavy door groaned open, revealing the dusty, debris-filled landscape. From a glass-walled observation deck high above, Izuku caught a glimpse of a familiar, skeletal figure. All Might. He was in his weakened form, his suit hanging loosely on his frame, but his eyes were fixed on them. On Izuku. The weight of that gaze was a physical thing. I'm watching, my boy. Show them what you can do. Izuku took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and damp concrete. One for all sparked to life, green lightning crackling around his limbs. He kept it at a steady 8%, enough for enhanced agility and strength without putting undue strain on his body. Let's go, everyone! Ida commanded, taking the lead. The class surged forward, fanning out into the disaster zone. Immediately, their training kicked in. Kirishima hardened his body, acting as a human battering ram to clear a path through a wall of smaller debris. Uraraka tapped larger chunks of concrete, sending them floating harmlessly upwards. Todoroki created a smooth ramp of ice over a treacherous pit. It was controlled chaos, a symphony of quirks working towards a single purpose. Izuku felt a surge of pride. This was Yue. This was what it meant to be heroes. His own role was clear. With his enhanced mobility, he was a search and rescue specialist. He leaped from one stable platform to another, his eyes scanning the urban graveyard for the bright orange of the rescue dummies. His mind was already at work, a constant stream of analysis flowing through him. That building is showing signs of imminent collapse. The support beams on the 3rd floor are compromised. Avoid. The ground here is unstable, likely a sinkhole beneath the pavement. A wide berth is necessary. There, a glint of metal. Could be a trapped civilian. No, just a street lamp. He was in his element. This was a puzzle, a complex, 3-dimensional problem to be solved with brains and carefully applied brawn. He spotted his first target, a dummy pinned beneath a flipped car, its leg trapped at an awkward angle. He landed softly beside it, the soles of his shoes crunching on shattered glass. Okay, assess the situation. The car was a sedan, roughly 1.5 tons. The frame was resting directly on the dummy's leg sensor. Lifting it straight up was risky. The vehicle could shift and cause a secondary collapse of the surrounding rubble. He needed to be precise. He crouched, planting his feet firmly. One for all, full cowling, 15%. He whispered. The green energy flared brighter, a low hum vibrating through his bones. He slid his hands under the car's chassis, finding a solid grip. He didn't just lift, he angled the force, pushing it up and away, rolling the car onto its side in a single, smooth motion. It landed with a heavy thump a few feet away, raising a cloud of dust. The dummy was clear. Target 1 secured. He murmured, carefully lifting the dummy and bounding away towards the designated safe zone at the edge of the area. He deposited it gently, earning a green blink from the sensor on its chest. Success. He spent the next 20 minutes in a blur of motion. He located a critical objective, a sparking power transformer, and used a targeted Delaware Smash Air Force flick to kick up a wall of dirt and smother the Sparks, buying time for someone with a more suitable quirk like Kaminari to drain it safely. He guided Zero on where to place his tape to create a support structure for a teetering wall. He found 2 more dummies, one in a flooded subway entrance and another perched precariously on a ledge. He was feeling good. Confident. The ghosts of the old USJ were fading, replaced by the satisfaction of a job well done. He was faster, smarter, stronger. He was proving himself. That's when he saw it. The final dummy on his mental checklist. And it was in the worst possible spot. It was on the 2nd story of a half-demolished office building. The entire facade had been sheared away, exposing the floor plan like a dollhouse. The dummy was slumped in what looked like an old cubicle, pinned by a fallen section of the ceiling. But the real problem was the approach. The staircase was gone, and the entire structure groaned under its own weight, shedding a constant rain of dust and small pebbles. The floor around the dummy was a web of cracks, and a thick, rusted piece of rebar, once part of the building's reinforced concrete skeleton, was dangling from the ceiling directly above the target, swaying gently with the building's groans. It was a death trap. A textbook example of a high-risk, low-stability rescue. This is the test, he thought, his jaw tightening. This was the kind of challenge Aizawa-sensei would deliberately create. It wasn't just about strength, it was about analysis, precision, and nerve. From the corner of his eye, he saw Bakugo work on the other side of the zone. An orange explosion blossomed as he blasted a clear path to a trap dummy, his movements brutally efficient. He was probably already on his 4th or 5th rescue. The old, familiar sting of rivalry pushed Izuku forward. He couldn't fall behind. He backed up, giving himself a running start. Full cowling, 20%! The power surged, a comfortable fire in his veins now. He sprinted towards the building, leaped, and kicked off the side of a stable concrete pillar. He sailed through the air, landing with feather-light precision on the edge of the 2nd-story floor. The surface shifted under his feet, a low groan echoing through the structure. He froze, listening, feeling the vibrations through the soles of his shoes. Okay, easy. He needed to distribute his weight. He stayed low, almost crawling, moving towards the trap dummy. The air was thick with the chalky smell of pulverized concrete. He reached the dummy's side. It was pinned more firmly than he thought. A large slab of concrete lay across its torso. The dangling rebar was about 10 feet above him, a rusty pendulum of fate. It was a thick, jagged piece of metal, at least 2 inches in diameter. If it fell, he shook the thought away. Focus. He analyzed the slab. It was too heavy to move with one hand while holding the dummy with the other. He'd have to brace himself, lift the slab just enough to slide the dummy out from under it. It would put a massive, sudden strain on the already compromised floor. He took a deep breath. He could do this. He planted his feet as best he could on what felt like the most solid section of floor. He reached for the edge of the concrete slab. His fingers brushed against the cold, rough surface. And then it happened. His movement, slight as it was the final straw. A tremor ran through the floor beneath him. A spiderweb of new cracks spread out from his feet. High above, the chunk of concrete holding the rebar shifted with a sickening crack. The rebar, freed from its precarious perch, began to fall. Time seemed to warp, stretching like taffy. The world slowed to a crawl. He saw the rebar tipping over, the rust flaking off in a slow-motion shower. He saw the path it would take, straight down. He had a fraction of a second to react, to throw himself backward, to do something. His body tensed. One for all coiled in his legs, ready to spring. And then his world shattered. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a physical impact. It was a cataclysm in his mind. An onslaught. A psychic detonation that ripped through his consciousness, tearing reality apart at the seams. Flash. The world lurches. He's looking up. Cold, sharp agony blossoms in his throat. He can't breathe. He can't scream. The rebar has punched clean through his neck, pinning him to the concrete floor. The taste of iron and copper floods his mouth. He tries to gurgle a name. All Might? Mom? But only a wet, choking sound emerges. The light of the USJ dome dims, his own blood blurring his vision. He feels the frantic, useless twitching of his fingers, and then, nothing. Flash. Darkness. Utter, complete darkness and a pressure so immense it feels like a mountain has fallen on him. The rebar missed. He had dodged it. But his dodge, the sheer force of his 20% leap, was the final vibration the unstable floor could take. The entire section he was standing on gave way. He is falling, but only for an instant before the rest of the ceiling comes down on top of him. The sound isn't a crash. It's a dull, final crunch as his skull, his ribs, his entire body is compacted into pulp beneath tons of concrete. His last sensation is not pain, but a profound, deafening silence. Flash. Wind screaming in his ears. He overcompensated. He threw himself backward, away from the rebar, clear off the edge of the building. It's a 3-story drop, but instead of solid ground, he sees a junkyard of twisted metal below. A support beam, sharpened to a spear-like point from the initial collapse, is waiting for him. He has no time to correct his trajectory. He sees it rushing up to meet him, a glint of sunlight on the sharp edge. He hits it chest first. The impact is a white-hot nova of pain that vaporizes thought, shatters bone, and stills his heart in a single, brutal instant. Flash. A sizzle. A pop. He dodged the rebar, but stumbled into a tangle of severed wires near the wall. A loose power line, knocked from its conduit by the initial tremor, is live. It brushes against the puddle of water leaking from a broken pipe next to him. The moment his foot touches the water, a billion volts seize every muscle in his body. His world becomes a strobe light of agonizing, uncontrollable convulsions. The smell of burning ozone and his own hair fills his nostrils. His vision whites out, his brain cooked in his skull. He dies dancing a terrible, jerky puppet's jig, held by the strings of raw electricity. Flash. 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 He slips on a loose pebble and the rebar grazes his temple, causing a cerebral hemorrhage. He dies an hour later in Recovery Girl's infirmary. He uses the Delaware smash to deflect the rebar, but the shockwave brings the rest of the building down, crushing not only him but also Kirishima, who was passing below. He hesitates for a split second too long and the rebar hits the concrete slab, shattering it and sending a razor-sharp piece of shrapnel into his eye, piercing his brain. He survives the fall, but a secondary villain attack, unrelated, targets the rubble he's in. He dies. He dies. He dies. He dies. 12. 24. 100 vivid, hyper-realistic, sensory-overloaded deaths. He felt every single one. The impalement. The crushing weight. The fall. The burn. He experienced the last, terrifying moments of his own life over and over and over again, all within the span of a single, drawn-out nanosecond. The torrent of horrific futures slammed into him, and his mind, his body, his very soul, blue-screened. He was back in the real world. The rebar was still falling, only halfway through its descent. But Izuku was no longer there. His mind was a maelstrom of his own death echoes. The connection between his brain and his body was severed. His muscles, which had been coiled and ready to spring, went slack. His eyes, wide with a horror that no one else could see, were unfocused, staring into 1,000 different fatal timelines at once. He saw the real, falling rebar, but he also saw the ghost of it already sticking out of his throat. He felt the real floor beneath his feet, but he also felt the phantom sensation of it collapsing into an abyss. He was trapped. A statue carved from fear. His mind was screaming, a silent, primal shriek that had no outlet. Move! Jump! Dodge! Do something! You're going to die. But which way to move? Every direction he could conceive of was a path he had just experienced ending in agony. If he jumped left, he'd bring the ceiling down. If he jumped right, he'd be electrocuted. If he jumped back, he'd be impaled from below. It was a fatal labyrinth, a Schrodinger's box where every possible outcome was his own corpse. So he did nothing. He froze. A perfect, complete paralysis born of absolute terror and sensory overload. Time snapped back to its normal speed. The rebar whistled through the air. It was less than a foot from his head. Move it, DKU! The roar was pure, concentrated rage. It was a sound more sudden and shocking than any of the deaths he had just witnessed. A flash of orange and white heat seared the air next to him. Boom! A focused, precise AP shot blast erupted from Bakugo's palm. The condensed explosion struck the falling rebar not at its tip, but in its center, changing its trajectory instantly. Instead of plummeting down into Izuku's skull, it was blasted sideways, spinning like a top. It slammed into the far wall of the ruined office with a deafening clang and showered the area with concrete dust. The shockwave of the blast and the primal fury of Bakugo's voice finally broke the spell. Izuku flinched back, stumbling, his limbs finally obeying him. He fell hard on his rear, scrambling away from the spot where he had just seen himself die 100 times over. He looked up. Bakugo was perched on a nearby pile of rubble, one hand still smoking. His red eyes narrowed into slits of pure contempt. "What the hell are you doing, you damn nerd?" Bakugo snarled, his voice dripping with disgust. "You just gonna stand there and let it kill you? You trying to get yourself nominated for a Darwin Award?" Izuku couldn't answer. He couldn't speak. His mouth opened, but only a dry, ragged gasp came out. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic, panicked rhythm that was completely out of sync with his breathing. He was hyperventilating, his vision swimming. A cold, clammy sweat broke out over his entire body, soaking the collar of his uniform. He started to tremble, an uncontrollable shiver that began in his hands and quickly spread through his entire frame. The world felt thin. Unreal. He could still feel the phantom pain in his throat, the ghost of immense pressure on his chest. The images, the horrifyingly lucid flashes of his own demise, were burned onto the inside of his eyelids. "Deku!" Uraraka's voice, laced with worry, cut through the haze. She was floating down from a higher ledge, Ida right behind her, his engines firing in controlled bursts. "Are you okay? What happened?" Izuku just stared at them, his eyes wide and wild. He looked from Uraraka's concerned face to Ida's rigid posture, to Bakugo's sneering visage. He looked at the spot where the rebar had been about to fall. He looked at his own hands, which were shaking so badly he could barely make a fist. I, he stammered, his voice hoarse. He couldn't explain. How could he? I froze because I saw every possible way I could have died in the next few seconds. They'd think he was insane. They'd pull him from the hero course. High above, in the observation deck, two figures watched the scene unfold with growing concern. "What was that?" Tashinori Yagi asked, his voice a low rumble. He leaned forward, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. "He just stopped. Midoriya never freezes." Aizawa's eyes were narrowed, his gaze analytical and sharp. He rewound the security footage on the monitor in front of him, playing the moment back in slow motion. He saw the rebar fall. He saw Midoriya tense, and then he saw the change. The boy's posture went completely slack, his eyes unfocused. Total disassociation. It wasn't the hesitation of fear. It was a complete system shutdown. "He's been through a lot," Aizawa said, though his tone lacked conviction. "The Kamino incident, the fight with Muscular, the USJ attack. It could be a form of PTSD. A trigger he wasn't aware of, but he's been in high-stress situations since Kamino." All Might countered, his voice tight with worry. "He's been getting more confident, more controlled. This was a regression. A catastrophic one, if Bakugo hadn't been there." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Aizawa zoomed in on Midoriya's face on the screen. The sheer, undiluted terror in the boy's eyes was unsettling. It wasn't the look of someone who'd had a close call. It was the look of someone who had stared directly into the abyss, and the abyss had shown him something unspeakable. "I'll have him checked by Recovery Girl," Aizawa decided, his voice flat. "But I'm taking him off the field for today. Something's wrong." Down in the dust and rubble, Izuku was helped to his feet by Ida. He felt disconnected from his own body, like he was piloting a machine from a great distance. His legs were unsteady, his head light. "Midoriya, you must report to the infirmary immediately," Ida insisted, his usual bluster replaced with genuine concern. "You may have a concussion or be suffering from shock." Izuku could only nod numbly. He allowed Ida to guide him away, Uraraka fluttering anxiously at his other side. He risked one last glance back at Bakugo, who was now just watching him, the anger in his expression having been replaced by something else. A flicker of confusion. Of suspicion. The walk to the edge of the zone was a blur. The sounds of the other students continuing the exercise, an explosion from Bakugo, a crackle of acid from Mina, the whir of Ciro's tape, seemed to come from a million miles away. His world had shrunk to the pounding in his ears and the slideshow of death that kept replaying in his mind. Recovery Girl's examination was blessedly brief. She checked his pupils, took his blood pressure, and ran a scanner over his head. "Physically, you're fine, dearie," she said, her voice gentle. "No signs of head trauma. Your heart rate is elevated, but that's to be expected after a scare. You just had a nasty fright, that's all, a fright." It felt like such a small, inadequate word for the mental holocaust he had just endured. Aizawa-sensei dismissed him for the rest of the day. "Go back to the dorms. Rest. We'll talk about this later, Midoriya." The way he said his name sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him. It wasn't angry. It was clinical. He was a problem to be analyzed. A piece of faulty equipment. He trudged back to Heights Alliance alone, the silence of the empty halls a stark contrast to the chaos still raging in his head. He made it to his room, his all-might shrine, and closed the door, leaning his back against it as if to physically bar the world from entry. The room was his sanctuary. Posters of All Might in his prime smiled down at him, fists raised in victory. Figurines stood proudly on his shelves. It was a room dedicated to hope, to a symbol of unbreakable optimism. Today, it offered no comfort. He stumbled to his small desk and collapsed into his chair. He stared at his hands, turning them over and over. He could still feel the phantom sensation of them being crushed, the bones turning to dust. He touched his throat, his fingers tracing the line where he'd felt the rebar enter. He took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the clean air of his room, but his mind supplied the memory of blood and concrete dust. It was real. What he saw, what he felt, had been utterly real. It wasn't a daydream, or an overactive imagination. It was a warning. No, it was more than that. It was a series of detailed, explicit blueprints for his own destruction. He lurched to his feet and stared at his reflection in the dark screen of his computer monitor. His face was pale, his eyes huge and haunted. For a split second, a trick of the light, he saw it, a ghostly afterimage of the rebar superimposed over his neck. He cried out and stumbled back, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the floor. He lay there, curled in a ball, shaking. The first chime had rung. A clock had started ticking somewhere deep inside him. A terrible, silent countdown. Every fight, he now realized, wouldn't just be a fight. It would be a puzzle, a horrifying puzzle where he was the maze, the dead ends were his own corpses, and somewhere, hidden in the onslaught of fatal possibilities, was a single, narrow path to survival. Every second was a countdown. And he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence was the first thing he noticed. Back in the Heights Alliance dorm, the world was supposed to be quiet, but it was a comfortable, living silence, punctuated by the distant sounds of his classmates. The rustle of a page turning in the common room, the soft thud of a closing bedroom door, the low hum of the refrigerator. This was different. This was the profound, ringing silence of a tomb. His tomb. Izuku sat on the edge of his bed, his body rigid, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. He hadn't moved for what felt like hours. He had trudged back from the USJ in a daze, every step an effort of will. He'd ignored the curious glances from other students in the hallway, his gaze fixed on the floor, the patterns in the linoleum swimming in and out of focus. Aizawa's words, "Go back to the dorms. Rest," echoed in his head, a hollow, meaningless command. Rest was a country he could no longer visit. His all-might-themed room, once his sanctuary of hope, now felt like a prison of cruel irony. The posters on the wall depicted a hero who was unbreakable, a man who met every threat with a booming laugh and fists of righteous fury. All Might, the symbol of peace, had never frozen. He had never been paralyzed by 100 visions of his own gruesome end. The smiling faces seemed to mock him, their bright, primary colors a stark contrast to the gray dread that had settled deep in his bones. He was cold. A deep, unshakable chill had taken root in his marrow, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the cold of the abyss he had glimpsed. The cold of the grave. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the images away, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. The moment his vision went dark, they flooded back in, unbidden and vivid. Flash. The rebar in his throat, the gurgling, helpless sound. Flash. The immense, final pressure of the collapsing ceiling. Flash. The searing, electric agony as his body convulsed. He gasped, his eyes flying open. He couldn't close them. He couldn't be in the dark. The dark was where they lived. He stood up, his movements stiff and jerky, and began to pace the small space of his room. 3 steps to the window, turn, 3 steps to the door, turn. It was a caged animal's rhythm. He had to do something. He had to process. Analyze. That's what he did. He analyzed quirks, heroes, villains, support items. He broke them down into their component parts, understood their mechanics, and formulated strategies. Could he do that with this? With this curse? His eyes fell on his shelf of notebooks. Hero analysis for the future, the spines read, numbered 1 through 13. They were filled with his frantic, detailed scrawls, diagrams of costumes, and speculations on ultimate moves. They were his life's work, his passion. Now, looking at them, he felt a profound sense of detachment. They were artifacts from a different life, written by a different boy. A boy who had believed heroism was a puzzle you could solve by studying others. He hadn't understood that the most complex and deadly puzzle would be himself. He needed a new notebook. The thought was sudden and absolute. He couldn't taint his hero notes with this. This was something else. Something dark and private. Driven by this new, grim purpose, he grabbed his wallet and his room key and slipped out of the dorm. The building was empty, his classmates still at the USJ, their excited shouts from the morning a distant memory. The walk to the nearby convenience store was surreal. The sun was bright, the sky a placid blue. People on the street laughed, chatted on their phones, went about their lives with a blissful ignorance that Izuku suddenly envied with every fiber of his being. They didn't know how fragile it all was. They didn't know that in any given second, 100 tiny variables could align to snuff them out. A speeding car, a loose sign, a sudden aneurysm. Did everyone have this? Was the world a constant, swirling vortex of potential death that only he could now see? No. That was impossible. This was him. This was new. He found what he was looking for in the stationery aisle. It wasn't fancy. It was a simple, stark notebook with a plain black cover, its pages a clean, intimidating white. It felt cold and heavy in his hands, an object of grim portent. He paid for it in cash, avoiding the cashier's gaze, and walked back to the dorms, the plastic bag crinkling with each step like the shedding of a snake's skin. Back in his room, he sat at his desk and placed the black notebook before him. For a long time, he just stared at it. Opening it felt like signing a contract with a devil he didn't understand. But not opening it, letting the horror fester in his mind unchecked, was worse. With a trembling hand he picked up a pen. The pen he used for his hero notes was a multicolored clicky affair. For this, he chose a simple black ballpoint. He opened the notebook to the first page. The pristine white stared back at him. What do you write on the first page of your own personal apocalypse? His hand moved, his familiar, analytical scrawl taking over, but the words were alien. Mortality analysis for the future. Subject, Midoriya Izuku. He stared at the title. It was a grotesque parody of his life's ambition. He felt a wave of nausea, but he pushed it down, channeling the fear into a cold, clinical focus. It was the only way to stay sane. He turned the page. Entry 001, USJ Collapse Zone Incident. Trigger, High-Stress Rescue Scenario. Impending danger, falling rebar. Phenomenon, involuntary, instantaneous flood of multiple future timelines, all resulting in subject's death within a 60-second timeframe. He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. How do I even describe this? Observed fatalities, partial list. 1. Impalement, rebar through cervical spine/trachea. Cause of death, asphyxiation, massive blood loss. Sensation profile, sharp, piercing trauma followed by rapid loss of motor control and consciousness. Extreme panic. 2. Crushing, full structural collapse of floor/ceiling. Cause of death, massive blunt force trauma, compressive asphyxia. Sensation profile, overwhelming pressure, instantaneous cessation of thought. 3. Electrocution, contact with live wire via water medium. Cause of death, cardiac arrest, neurological damage. Sensation profile, uncontrollable convulsions, extreme full body pain, sensation of burning from the inside out. 4. Kinetic trauma, 3-story fall onto sharpened debris. Cause of death, puncture of heart/lungs. Sensation profile, brief sensation of falling, followed by white-hot, singular point of impact. Instantaneous. 5. Secondary shrapnel, deflection of initial threat leads to shattering of nearby concrete. Cause of death, high-velocity projectile penetrating ocular cavity into brain. Sensation profile, sharp, localized pain in head, followed by disorientation and darkness. He wrote and wrote, his hand flying across the page. He detailed every single death he could remember from the torrent, his mind replaying each one with chilling clarity as he documented it. He drew diagrams, a small, shaky sketch of the office layout. Arrows indicating the path of the rebar. A dotted line showing where he would have fallen. X's marking the spots where he died. This was his new analysis. Not of strengths, but of fatal weaknesses. Not of powers, but of probabilities. He was cataloging his own obsolescence. When he finally stopped, his hand was cramping and 10 pages were filled with his tight, frantic script. He felt hollowed out, but marginally better. The act of writing it down, of externalizing the horror and pinning it to the page like a dissected insect, gave him the barest illusion of control. It's not real, a desperate part of his brain insisted. It's just my mind playing tricks on me. A panic attack. A hallucination. It has to be. He clung to Aizawa's theory like a drowning man to a splinter of wood. PTSD? That made sense. He'd seen so much death and destruction. All Might's fight with All for One. Sir Nightai's death. The Shai Hasaikai raid. Of course his mind was damaged. Of course it would conjure up nightmares. The visions weren't precognition. They were trauma-induced hypotheticals. His analytical brain, warped by fear, was just running disaster simulations at high speed. He had to believe that. If he didn't, if this was a new power, a part of One for All, what did that mean? The previous users had all lived with this incredible burden of power. Had any of them been cursed with this? To see their own end around every corner? The thought was too much to bear. It had to be trauma. It was the only explanation that allowed for a cure, for a return to normalcy. The rest of the day passed in a fugue state. He heard his classmates return late in the afternoon, their voices loud and energetic in the hall. He heard Bakugo's signature stomp, followed by Kirishima's cheerful greeting. He heard Uraraka and Ida talking in hushed, worried tones outside his door for a moment before moving on. He didn't answer. He couldn't face them. He couldn't fake a smile, not now. He skipped dinner, the very thought of food making his stomach churn. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across his room, his manufactured calm began to fray. The rationalizations felt thin, flimsy excuses against the terrifying certainty. Night fell. And with the night came a new, more insidious kind of fear. He tried to sleep. He changed into his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and slid under his covers, pulling the All Might-themed comforter up to his chin. He lay in the darkness, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the dorm at 2 a.m. was absolute. And in that silence, his mind began to wander. It started small. A tiny, intrusive thought. The ceiling fan directly above me, the bolts holding it look a little old. What if they gave way? Flash. A sudden, sharp crack from above. He has no time to react. The heavy motor and spinning blades crash down onto his head. The world is a spray of red and a brief, concussive agony before eternal blackness. He gasped, bolting upright in bed, his heart pounding. His eyes darted to the ceiling fan. It was still there, turning with a gentle, rhythmic whir. Unchanged. Unthreatening. But the vision had been so real, the sound, the sensation. He threw the covers off, his skin slick with sweat. He needed some water. His throat was parchment dry. He crept out of his room, his footsteps silent on the cool floor. The common room was bathed in the pale, sterile glow of a single security light. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to writhe in his peripheral vision. The familiar couch looked like a crouching beast. The coat rack by the door looked like a gaunt, skeletal figure. Paranoia. It was just paranoia. He reached the stairs. He placed a foot on the top step. Don't look down, he thought. Just go down the stairs like a normal person. But he couldn't help it. His gaze dropped. And the visions came. Flash. His foot slips on the smooth wood. His ankle twists with a wet, popping sound. He pitches forward, arms flailing, but there's nothing to grab onto. His head connects with the sharp edge of the third step down. A sickening, melon-like crack echoes in the silent dorm. His body tumbles the rest of the way down, a limp, boneless puppet, coming to rest in a broken heap at the bottom. His last sight is the ceiling, upside down. Flash. He stumbles but catches himself on the railing. But the railing, weakened by one of Kaminari's recent electrical mishaps, splinters under his weight. He falls sideways through the broken wood, and lands on the hard tile floor of the foyer below. The impact shatters his spine. He lies there, paralyzed from the neck down, unable to breathe, his lungs refusing to obey his panicked mind. Izuka froze on the top step, his hand gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white mountains on a pale field. His breath hitched. He could feel the phantom impact on his skull, the ghost of paralysis in his limbs. He backed away from the stairs slowly, as if retreating from a venomous snake. He couldn't go down there. The stairs were a death trap. Every step was a landmine. He retreated back to the hallway, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He leaned against the wall, trying to control his breathing. This was insane. It was just a staircase. He'd walked up and down it 1,000 times. It's the PTSD, he told himself again, the words a desperate, silent chant. Overactive imagination. Stress response. But the rationalizations were wearing thin, eroded by the sheer, visceral reality of what he was seeing. He saw Uraraka's door and a new, terrible thought surfaced. What if I asked her to float me down? But that was insane. How would he explain it? And what if something went wrong? What if her quirk failed for a split second? What if a sudden noise made her release him? He could already see it, a dozen new ways to die, all starting with him asking for help. He was trapped. Trapped on the second floor by his own mind. He felt a wave of helpless, hysterical laughter bubble in his chest, and he choked it down, biting his lip until he tasted blood. Crying or laughing, he wasn't sure which would come out if he let go. His gaze fell on his own door. His All Might nameplate. The lamp he'd left on. A small, comforting glow from under the door. But his new, twisted perception found the danger in it immediately. That lamp is old. The wiring could be faulty. A short circuit. Flash. The scent of burning plastic. He's asleep, dead to the world, exhausted from his waking nightmare. A tiny spark in the base of the lamp ignites the cheap plastic. It smolders, then catches. The flame crawls up the lampshade, then leaps to the curtains. The smoke alarm, its battery dead because he'd forgotten to change it, remains silent. He doesn't wake up. He breathes in the thick, acrid smoke, his lungs filling with poison. He dies peacefully, or so they'd say, a victim of carbon monoxide, his hero posters turning to black ash around him. Izuka stared at his own door in horror. He could almost smell the smoke, feel the heat. He was no longer safe in his own room. Nowhere was safe. The world had transformed into an endless gauntlet of potential fatalities, and he was the only one who could see them. He stumbled down the hall, away from the stairs, away from his room. He ended up in the communal kitchen, the big, sterile room lit by the digital display on the microwave, 3:17 a.m. He needed to ground himself, do something normal. Something real. He opened the fridge, the cool air washing over his face. He grabbed a carton of apple juice, his hand shaking so much that the liquid sloshed inside. He got a glass from the cupboard, his movements clumsy. He just needed to do one simple, normal thing without seeing a vision of it ending in his death. He set the glass on the counter. Beside the sink was the knife block. A gleaming set of chef's knives, lovingly sharpened by Sato, who took cooking as seriously as he took hero work. And then the thought. The terrible, scientific, analytical thought that pushed past the fear. The incident at the USJ was involuntary. The visions on the stairs and of the fire were passive, intrusive thoughts. But can I control it? Can I trigger it on purpose? It was a terrifying question. The sane part of his brain screamed at him to leave, to go back to his room and hide under the covers until morning. But the analyst, the boy who filled notebooks with data, was stronger. He had to know. He had to understand the parameters of his own personal hell. If this was a quirk, he needed to know how it worked. Knowledge was power, even if that knowledge was terrifying. His heart hammering, he reached out and slowly, deliberately, drew the largest knife from the block. The blade was a foot long, its edge a razor-sharp line of polished steel. It felt impossibly heavy in his hand. He held it up, the faint light of the microwave clock glinting off the surface. He focused on the knife. He focused on the simple, mundane task of cutting an apple that he'd grabbed from the fruit bowl. He held the knife. And he waited. For a second, nothing happened. A fragile sliver of hope bloomed in his chest. See? It was just a hallucination. It's over. Then the world dissolved. The trigger wasn't danger this time. It was intent. The moment he consciously considered the knife as a tool in his hand, the floodgates didn't just open, they were obliterated. It was 1,000 times worse than the rebar. The visions were a tidal wave, a chaotic, screaming montage of death, all centered on the blade in his hand. Flash. He reaches for an apple. His hand is slick with condensation from the juice carton. The knife slips. The tip catches on the counter, the handle pivots, and the blade slices deep into his wrist, severing the radial artery. Blood pulses out in a shocking, rhythmic fountain, painting the white countertop crimson. He fumbles for his phone, his vision already going gray at the edges. He doesn't make it. Flash. He's cutting the apple. A sudden, violent muscle spasm, a side effect of one for all he's never experienced before, seizes his arm. His hand jerks upwards, driving the point of the knife under his own jaw and into his brainstem. Instantaneous death. His body stands there for a full second before collapsing. Flash. Ida, on his pre-dawn patrol of the dorms for rule-breakers, comes up behind him silently. Midoriya! It is past curfew. Ida's booming voice startles him so badly he jumps, spinning around, the knife held out in front of him. The blade enters Ida's chest. The look of shock and betrayal on his friend's face is the last thing Izuka sees before a black portal, Kurogyri style, opens behind him. A hand shoots out, grabs the knife from Ida's body, and plunges it into Izuka's back. A villain attack. Random. Unforeseeable. Fatal. Flash. He slips on a drop of juice on the floor, falling forward. The knife, held point down, goes through his own chest, piercing his heart. Flash. A micro-earthquake, a tremor no one else even feels, rattles the building just enough to make him lose his balance. Flash. 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 50. 100. More. He dies stabbing himself by accident. He dies being disarmed by a villain. He dies after accidentally hurting a friend. He dies in ways so convoluted and unlikely they border on the absurd, yet he feels every single one. The worst one, the one that makes him want to vomit up his own soul, is a flicker of a timeline where the constant bombardment of visions drives him insane, and in a moment of sheer despair to make it stop, he turns the blade on himself. The onslaught was too much. A spike of pure, crystalline pain erupted behind his right eye, as if an ice pick had been hammered into his skull. The pressure built and built until something inside him gave way. A warm, thick trickle of liquid ran from his nose. He dropped the knife. It clattered to the floor with a deafening clang that echoed the shattering of his composure. He stumbled back, clutching his head, a strangled sob tearing from his throat. The headache was blinding, his vision swimming with black spots. He touched his upper lip, and his fingers came away stained with dark, viscous blood. The vision stopped. The torrent receded, leaving behind only the echo of horror and the pounding, agonizing throb in his skull. This was real. This was not PTSD. This was not his imagination. This was a power. A power that had a physical, tangible cost. It was a part of him, a parasitic quirk nested within the heart of One for All, feeding on his fear and paying him back in blood and migraines. Deku? The voice was soft, hesitant, and it made him jump so violently he nearly screamed. He spun around, his eyes wide and wild. Uraraka stood in the kitchen entryway, her pink pajamas adorned with little stars. Her hair was messy from sleep, and her face was etched with deep concern. Behind her, Ida stood, already in his running gear, his expression a mixture of alarm and confusion. They must have heard the knife fall. We heard a crash, Uraraka said, taking a tentative step forward. Is everything okay? You're bleeding. Izuku quickly wiped his nose with the back of his hand, smearing the blood across his cheek. I'm fine, he choked out, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Fine. Just tripped. Got a nosebleed. Ida's eyes scanned the scene, the knife on the floor, Izuku's pale and sweaty face, his trembling hands, the wild look in his eyes. Ida's analytical mind was clearly not buying the simple explanation. Midoriya, he said, his voice unusually gentle. You have been acting erratically since the exercise today. You are pale, you missed dinner, and you are awake in the kitchen at 3 a.m. This is not indicative of someone who is fine. You look exhausted, Deku, Uraraka added, her brow furrowed with worry. You have big, dark circles under your eyes. Did you sleep at all? You can talk to us, you know. He wanted to. God, he wanted to break down right there and tell them everything. He wanted to confess the horror, to share the burden, to have his friends tell him it would be okay. But how could he? What would he even say? I can see every way I might die in the next hour, and just holding a kitchen knife showed me 50 ways it could kill me, and it makes my head bleed. They would think he was a danger to himself, a danger to them. They would go to Aizawa, and his hero career would be over before it even began. They couldn't bear this burden for him. This was his secret, his curse. He had to protect them from it, so he built the wall higher. I'm just tired, he said, forcing his voice to sound steady, though it came out thin and reedy. The exercise at the USJ, it just shook me up more than I thought. A close call, you know? It gets you thinking. He gestured vaguely at the knife on the floor. I was just getting a drink, and I knocked it over. Startled myself. It's nothing, really. He could see in their eyes that they didn't believe him. Uraraka's expression was full of hurt, a silent plea for him to trust them. Ida's was troubled, the look of a friend who knows something is deeply wrong but is being pushed away. If you are certain, Ida said slowly, his disapproval clear. But I would strongly recommend you speak with a counselor. Or All Might. Processing battlefield stress is crucial for a hero's longevity. I will. Izuku lied, his gaze fixed on a point just over Uraraka's shoulder. I promise. I'm just going to clean this up and go back to bed. Thanks for checking on me. The dismissal was polite, but it was a dismissal all the same. Uraraka lingered for a moment longer, her round face a mask of worry, before Ida gently placed a hand on her shoulder and guided her away. Let's let him rest, Uraraka. Izuku waited until he heard their bedroom doors click shut down the hall. Then, his legs gave out. He slid down the wall, his head in his hands, and finally let out the silent, shuddering sobs he'd been holding back. He hadn't just seen death, he had pushed away his friends. The isolation was now a choice, a self-imposed quarantine to keep them safe from his own fractured mind. After a long time, he picked himself up. He cleaned the knife and put it back in the block, his hand wrapped in a paper towel to avoid direct contact. He cleaned the drop of blood from the floor. He moved like an automaton, his actions detached and mechanical. He couldn't go back to his room. He couldn't face the stairs. He ended up in the communal bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The sting of it was a welcome, real sensation. He looked up, his eyes meeting his own reflection in the large mirror over the sinks. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. The smear of blood he missed was stark against his pale skin. He looked broken, and as he stared, the reflection wavered. It was just for a second, a flicker at the edge of his vision, but it was there. Overlaid on his own face, like a ghostly double exposure, he saw it. The image of his own throat, torn open by the rebar. The reflection flickered again, and for a terrifying instant, his skin looked charred and cracked, the memory of the electrocution. It shifted again, and he saw his own eyes, wide and lifeless, his skull caved in. He was seeing the ghosts of the deaths that weren't. They were a part of him now, clinging to his image, to his very identity. He no longer saw Izuku Midoriya, the aspiring hero. He saw a collection of potential corpses, a walking, talking ghost story waiting for its final chapter. He stared into his own haunted eyes, the eyes of a stranger. The last vestiges of the hopeful, crying boy who had inherited One for All felt like they had been scoured away, leaving only this trembling, paranoid creature behind. The first chime had rung. The first notebook was filled with nightmares, and in the oppressive silence of the dormitory, surrounded by the friends he could never confide in, Izuku Midoriya understood the profound and terrifying truth of his new existence. He was completely and utterly alone. The weekend was a fragile truce. A temporary ceasefire in the war against entropy that was Izuku's new life. For 2 blissful days after his horrifying nocturnal discovery, nothing had tried to kill him, or rather, the torrent of fatal visions had mercifully subsided, leaving behind only a low, humming anxiety, like the ghost of a migraine. He had chalked it up to exhaustion and a lack of immediate, perceivable threats. He'd slept in fits and starts, waking with a gasp from nightmares he couldn't quite recall, his black notebook a cold, heavy weight in his desk drawer. On Saturday afternoon, a rare, school-sanctioned trip into the city was announced. A chance for the students to decompress, to remember what a normal life felt like, to spend their allowances. It was meant to be a reward for their hard work, a slice of teenage normalcy they were all starved for. For Izuku, it was a minefield. Every step out of the dorms was an act of calculated risk. He saw the bus they were taking and had to physically suppress the flicker of a dozen gruesome traffic accidents. He sat next to the emergency exit, not for safety, but because his brain had already supplied him with a vision of the main door jamming shut in a fire. He was quiet on the ride, offering tight, distracted smiles to his friends, his mind a frantic scanner identifying potential hazards. The wobbly-looking billboard, the construction crane in the distance, the strange noise from the bus's engine. He was living in a world made of glass, and he was the only one who could see the cracks. "Deku? Are you feeling okay?" Uraraka asked, her voice pulling him from his grim reverie. They were standing at the entrance to the sprawling, multi-leveled Kiyoshi Ward shopping mall. The place was a monument to consumerism and peace, a cathedral of glass and gleaming steel teeming with people. The air smelled of popcorn, perfume, and blissful ignorance. "Yeah. Fine," Izuku chirped, the enthusiasm sounding tinny and false even to his own ears. "Just a lot of people. It is certainly a bustling hub of commerce," Ida declared, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the crowd with the intensity of a security chief. "Remember, everyone, we are to stay in groups of no less than 3. We are still representing Yui High School, so conduct yourselves accordingly." Bakugo just snorted, jamming his hands in his pockets. "Whatever, Four Eyes. I'm going to the arcade. Don't follow me, you damn nerds." He stomped off, Kirishima and Kaminari trailing him like cheerful, shark-toothed remoras. Izuku found himself in a group with Uraraka, Ida, Todoroki, and Tsuyu. It should have been comfortable. It should have been fun. But Izuku couldn't relax. The mall's open-plan design, with its crisscrossing escalators, glass railings, and vast central atrium, was an architect's dream and his nightmare. From their position on the ground floor, he could see 3 levels above them, each a platform from which 1,000 different forms of death could originate. A dropped bag, a clumsy child, a faulty railing. "Ooh, let's check out that hero merch store," Uraraka said, pointing towards a brightly lit storefront. "I wonder if they have any new 13 merch." As they walked, Izuku found his gaze drifting upwards. His mind, now horribly attuned to this new perception, was cataloging threats automatically. That large planter on the 3rd floor railing is not properly secured. A strong enough shove could send it over. The main chandelier has a visible layer of dust. Maintenance might be subpar. A structural failure is a low probability, high-impact event. He felt a headache beginning to bloom behind his eyes, a familiar throb of pressure. This was the cost of passive scanning. Just existing in a complex environment was putting a strain on him. Midoriya, you seem distracted, Todoroki noted, his voice a low, even monotone. He had a unique ability to cut through the noise, both external and internal. Is something on your mind? Izuku jumped, startled. No! Not at all. Just thinking about training strategies. He lied, the excuse already feeling worn and thin. Todoroki just gave him a long, searching look, his heterochromatic eyes hard to read. He didn't press the issue, but Izuku had the distinct feeling he wasn't convinced. They spent an hour in a state of fractured normalcy. Izuku tried to engage, he really did. He commented on a new Gang Orca figurine, helped Ida compare the specs on different running shoes, and listened to Tsuyu's deadpan commentary on the fashion choices in a clothing store window. But all the while, a part of his brain was running its grim calculus. He was a walking, talking risk assessment program, and the results were terrifying. They were gathered in the central atrium, a vast, open space that soared 4 stories high to a glass dome roof. Ida was lecturing them on the structural integrity of the dome, while Uraraka was trying to decide between a crepe and ice cream. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, and then the screaming started. It began on the 2nd floor, a single shriek of terror that was quickly multiplied into a chorus of panic. People started running, a chaotic tide of humanity surging away from the epicenter. Then the floating began. A kiosk selling phone cases lifted slowly from the ground, wobbled, and then shot sideways, smashing into a sporting goods store window with a deafening crash of glass. A row of potted plants tore free from their moorings, hovering in the air like strange, green planets. A vintage car on display in the center of the atrium groaned as it was lifted 10 feet into the air, its tires spinning uselessly. Izuku's head snapped up. His friends were already in motion, their civilian identities melting away to reveal the heroes beneath. A villain! Ida yelled, already ushering a group of panicked shoppers towards an exit. Uraraka, help with crowd control. Todoroki, defensive positions. Izuku's eyes scanned the chaos, trying to pinpoint the source. There. On the 2nd floor balcony, standing right where the first screams had come from, was a man. He was lanky, dressed in a garish purple suit, and had a manic grin plastered on his face. His hands were outstretched, his fingers wiggling, and the air around him seemed to shimmer and warp. Gravity in his vicinity had gone on strike. Behold, the glorious chaos of Gambit! The villain crowed, his voice amplified by the atrium's acoustics. Your predictable, orderly world is so boring. Let's introduce a little unpredictability. He flicked a finger, and a public bench ripped from its bolts, hurtling towards a fleeing family. I've got it! Ida shouted, activating his reciprocal burst to intercept. This was it. A real fight. A real crisis. The muscle memory from 100 battles took over. Izuku planted his feet, grit his teeth, and called upon his power. One for all, full cowling, 20%! The green lightning erupted around him, a familiar cocoon of power. The world sharpened, his senses heightened. He was ready to leap, to analyze the enemy, to save. The visions hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't a trickle or a flood. It was a tsunami. A mental apocalypse that dwarfed everything he had experienced before. The sheer number of variables, the chaotic projectiles, the panicking crowd, the presence of his powerful friends, the multi-leveled environment, created an explosive, exponential growth in the number of ways he could die. Flash. He leaps towards the villain. A car, the one hovering in the center of the atrium, is sent crashing down directly on top of him. He's flattened into a red paste on the polished marble floor. Flash. He dodges the car, but Bakugo, arriving on the scene from the arcade, lets loose an indiscriminate howitzer impact. A piece of shrapnel from a destroyed kiosk, propelled by the explosion, flies like a bullet and severs his jugular vein. He bleeds out in seconds, his last sight being Bakugo's horrified face. Flash. He tries a long-range attack, a Delaware Smash Air Force. Gambit casually alters the gravity around the air bullet, causing it to swerve unpredictably. It misses the villain entirely and blows out a massive glass panel on the third floor, which then rains down like a guillotine on a group of civilians he was trying to protect. In the ensuing chaos, Gambit drops a vending machine on his head. Flash. Todoroki creates a massive ice wall to block debris. Izuku jumps on it for leverage, but Gambit's quirk makes the surface momentarily frictionless. He slips, falling into the path of a projectile Ida was deflecting. He dies from friendly fire. Flash. 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 Crushed. Impaled. Blown up. Sliced by glass. Trampled by the stampede. Hit by Uraraka's meteor shower when she releases debris she'd floated. He dies saving a child but failing to see the second projectile. He dies tripping on a spilled purse. He dies when Gambit makes the air in his lungs momentarily heavier than lead. 237 distinct, fully realized death scenarios slammed into his brain in less than a second. He felt the phantom pains of every single one. The crushing weight, the searing heat, the sharp slice, the dull thud. His mind was a charnel house of his own future corpses. He staggered back, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His vision swam, the real world blurring with the ghostly overlays of his potential deaths. He could see the real, hovering car, but also the phantom of it already smashed on the floor where he stood. He could see Bakugo arriving, but also the deadly shrapnel already flying from an explosion that hadn't happened yet. He was freezing. Just like at the USJ. The sheer volume of negative outcomes was paralyzing him. Every path he could take was a beautifully illustrated map to the graveyard. His body refused to move, locked in a state of absolute terror and sensory overload. The headache was back, a vicious, stabbing pain behind his eyes, and he felt the warm, familiar trickle from his nose. No, a voice screamed in the hurricane of his mind. Not again. I am not that person anymore. I will not freeze. He squeezed his eyes shut, a move that would have been suicide a moment ago, but now it was a desperate act of will. He forced out the visions of death and forced in the image of his black notebook. The stark, neat lines. The clinical analysis. The visions are not a curse, he thought, the idea a flickering candle in a hurricane. They are data. Horrifying, painful data, but data nonetheless. Analyze it. Don't just experience it. Analyze it. He opened his eyes. The world was still a chaotic mess of real threats and phantom deaths, but his perspective had shifted. He wasn't just a victim in the crossfire anymore. He was the analyst at the command center, watching 200 different simulations play out at once. He had to find the pattern. He had to solve the puzzle. Step 1. Define the variables. Enemy, Gambit. Quirk appears to be localized gravity manipulation. Seems to have a range limit, and requires line of sight. He's cocky, theatrical. Likes to use the environment. Not a direct combatant. Environment, multi-level, open atrium. Lots of potential projectiles, kiosks, planters, furniture. Lots of glass. Fragile. Civilians scattered, panicked. Primary objective is their safety. Allies, Ida is on crowd control. Uraraka is trying to secure floating objects. Todoroki is creating defensive barriers. Bakugo is, being Bakugo, all offense. Step 2, run the simulations and analyze failure points. He let the visions flow, but this time, he was looking for the why. Timeline branch A, direct assault, my role. Every scenario where he, Izuku, charged directly at Gambit ended in failure. Gambit wasn't a physical match, but he was a master of using the environment. He would simply drop something heavy on Izuku or alter the gravity beneath his feet to send him flying. Conclusion: a direct frontal assault is suicide. My path to the villain is blocked by a wall of deadly physics. Timeline branch B, ally-led assault, Bakugo. He focused on the timelines where Bakugo took the lead. The raw power was immense. Bakugo would launch himself into the air, a human missile, but Gambit, grinning, would simply create a small, intense gravity well right in front of him. Bakugo's AP shot wouldn't fly straight, it would spiral, deflecting off the warped space and careening into the crowd. In one vision, it hit a bus stop outside the mall. In another, it destabilized the second-floor walkway, causing a collapse. Conclusion: Bakugo's raw, untargeted power is a liability here. It's too unpredictable against Gambit's quirk. Timeline Branch C, Coordinated Support, Uraraka Ida. What if they work together? He saw a timeline where he directed Uraraka to make Gambit himself weightless. It worked. Gambit started to float, his control wavering. But before Ida could race up a wall to capture him, Gambit, laughing, touched a massive, floating advertising screen. He transferred the zero-gravity effect, grounding himself and sending the 10-ton screen plummeting towards Ida. Conclusion: the villain can likely transfer his effect. Any direct application of a similar quirk is too risky. His head was splitting open. The nosebleed was heavier now, dripping onto his top lip, the coppery taste sharp on his tongue. He was processing hundreds of failures, hundreds of deaths, his own, his friends, civilians. It was agony. But somewhere in this mountain of death, there had to be a path. There was always a path. Sir Night Eye had only seen one future. Izuku was seeing them all. The key wasn't to lament the fatal ones, but to find the single, solitary one that wasn't. He widened his search, looking for the tiny details, the edge cases. He saw 100 timelines where Todoroki used his ice. Most were defensive walls, but in a few, he went on offense, sending waves of ice up towards the balcony. They were all dodged or blocked by Gambit using a floating piece of debris as a shield. The shield. That was important. Gambit needed to see the attack to react to it. He relied on line of sight. The pieces began to click into place in his mind, forming a fragile, unbelievable chain of logic. It wasn't a simple plan. It was a sequence, a delicate, high-speed ballet of cause and effect that had to be executed perfectly. It was a Rube Goldberg machine of heroism, with a 99% chance of catastrophic failure. But it was the only one. The only path out of the 237 he'd seen where Gambit was captured, and no one else got hurt. He didn't have time to explain. He didn't have the words to describe the insane, precognitive vision that was guiding him. They would think he was crazy. They would hesitate. And hesitation would kill them all. He had to act. He had to trust his friends to be the brilliant heroes they were and react to the opportunities he was about to create. He locked his eyes on his target. Not Gambit, but a bright yellow sports car, suspended 20 feet in the air by the villain's power, halfway between Izuku and the second-floor balcony. It was a death sentence in 99 timelines. In one, it was the key. He took a deep breath, the air burning in his lungs. He wiped the blood from his face with his sleeve. Todoroki! He screamed, his voice raw and urgent. The sound cut through the chaos. Todoroki, who was in the middle of creating an ice barrier, turned his head, his eyes locking onto Izuku's. He saw the desperate intensity, the blood, the sheer, blazing focus, and he understood. Not the plan, but the need for immediate action. Izuku didn't wait for a reply. He channeled everything into his right leg, the green lightning of one for all flaring to a brilliant 20%. Delaware smash! He didn't aim at the villain. He didn't aim at the car itself. He kicked the air beneath the hovering vehicle. A compressed, targeted blast of wind erupted from his foot. It wasn't a destructive attack, it was a push. A precisely calculated nudge. The yellow car, caught in the sudden updraft, didn't fall. It swung. Like a massive, 2-ton pendulum, it swung upwards and forwards, its trajectory a perfect arc that Izuku had traced from a dozen failed visions. From his perch, Gambit laughed. A pathetic little gust of wind, hero? What's that supposed to do? He raised a hand, preparing to sweep the car aside or send it crashing down. But for 3 critical seconds, the swinging car was directly between him and Todoroki. Gambit's line of sight was broken. Todoroki didn't hesitate. He wasn't confused by Izuku's bizarre action. He saw the opening. He saw the 3-second window Izuku had just bought them with his insane, seemingly random attack. His left hand, which had been resting at his side, shot out. Flash freeze. It wasn't a clumsy wave of ice. It was a work of art. A high-speed, structural creation. A torrent of ice erupted from the ground, not at Gambit, but at the balcony itself. It surged upwards like a frozen geyser, branching out, wrapping around the pillars, encasing the railings, and, in a final, brilliant move, trapping Gambit's feet to the floor in a solid block of ice before he even realized his line of sight had returned. The villain's jaw dropped. He looked down at his encased feet, then back at Todoroki, his grin finally vanishing, replaced by disbelief. The floating objects around the atrium, their connection to his quirks severed by his shock and the ice interfering with his control, began to fall. "Uraraka, now!" Izuku roared, already moving. Uraraka, who had been watching the scene with wide eyes, slapped her hands together. "Release!" she commanded. She had managed to tag several of the largest pieces of debris while everyone was distracted. Instead of crashing down, they hovered gently, their momentum bled away. She and the other students still on the ground began guiding civilians out from under the remaining falling objects. The puzzle was solved. The trap was sprung, but the price was now due. The moment the immediate threat was neutralized, the adrenaline that had been holding Izuku together vanished. The full, crushing weight of what he had just done slammed into him. The mental strain of processing, filtering, and analyzing over 200 death visions in a matter of seconds had pushed his brain to its absolute limit. His vision dissolved into a gray, swimming haze. The roar of the crowd, the crackle of Todoroki's ice, the shouts of his friends, it all faded into a distant, underwater hum. The pain in his head exploded, a white-hot nova that erased all thought. His legs, which had just performed a miracle of precision, turned to water. He collapsed. Not a dramatic fall, but a quiet, boneless crumpling, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He hit the marble floor with a dull thud, his cheek pressed against the cold stone. The last thing he saw before the world went black was a pair of mismatched boots, one white, one dark, sprinting towards him. The last thing he felt was the thick, hot stream of blood pouring from his nose. His classmates saw a moment of incomprehensible, god-tier battlefield genius. They saw their quiet, analytical friend, under immense pressure, perform a non-lethal, perfectly coordinated takedown that used the environment, the enemy's weakness, and his allies' strengths in a way no textbook could ever teach. They saw a hero who, with a single, bizarre kick, had orchestrated a victory from the brink of disaster. They saw brilliant, instinctive improvisation of the highest order. Only he knew the truth. Only he knew that he hadn't been improvising. He had been carefully, desperately walking a tightrope over a canyon filled with his own dead bodies. He had navigated a minefield of his own corpses, guided by the screams of his own dying ghosts, just to find the one single, solitary path that led to this moment. The moment where everyone else was safe, and he was left broken on the floor. The world returned to him in pieces, a fractured mosaic of sensation. The first was the smell, antiseptic, sharp and clean, the unmistakable scent of Recovery Girl's infirmary. The second was the low, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, a sound he knew as well as his own name. The third was the dull, pounding ache behind his eyes, the familiar, angry ghost of his new power. Izuku's eyelids felt heavy, glued shut with exhaustion. He peeled them open, the fluorescent lights of the infirmary ceiling stabbing at his sensitive pupils. He was lying in one of the standard-issue beds, a thin blanket pulled up to his chest. An 4-line was taped to the back of his hand, feeding a clear fluid into his veins. "He's waking up." The voice was low, tired, and utterly devoid of nonsense. "Aizawa-sensei." Izuku pushed himself up, his elbows shaking. The room swam for a moment, and he squeezed his eyes shut until it settled. When he opened them again, he saw his teacher standing at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Beside him, in a visitor's chair, sat Tashinori Yagi, looking more skeletal and worried than Izuku had ever seen him. The sight of All Might's gaunt form, his blue eyes filled with a deep, cavernous concern, sent a pang of guilt through Izuku's chest. What happened?" Izuku asked, his voice a dry rasp. He remembered them all, the villain, the visions. He remembered the kick, the ice, the collapse. The rest was a blur. "The villain Gambit was apprehended," Aizawa said, his tone flat and clinical. "Thanks to an unorthodox but effective strategy. The civilians were evacuated safely. Minor property damage. Uraraka sustained a bruised shoulder from a piece of falling debris, but otherwise, your classmates are fine. You, on the other hand, collapsed from what Recovery Girl has determined to be extreme mental exhaustion and stress-induced epistaxis. A nosebleed, Izuku translated numbly. It sounded so small, so mundane, for what it represented. A severe one, All Might corrected, his voice gentle but firm. Young Midoriya, you've been unconscious for nearly 3 hours. 3 hours. He had bought them a victory, and it had cost him 3 hours of his life and a piece of his sanity. He looked down at his hands, expecting them to tremble, but they were steady. The storm had passed, leaving behind a desolate, aching calm. No, Aizawa said, pulling another chair over and sitting down, his movements economical and deliberate. He leaned forward, his dark eyes fixing Izuku with an unnerving intensity. We're going to talk, and you are going to tell me the truth. No more evasions. No more I was just stressed. I'm not buying it. Izuku's heart monitor gave a slight, traitorous jump in tempo. He swallowed, his throat suddenly tight. I don't know what you mean, Sensei. Aizawa's gaze didn't waver. It was like being pinned by a high-density weight. I saw the security footage from the mall, Midoriya. Just like I saw the footage from the USJ. In both instances you froze. You completely disengaged from your surroundings. At the USJ, you were paralyzed for 2.7 seconds, an eternity in a crisis. If Bakugo hadn't intervened, you'd be dead. Today, at the mall, you were frozen for 3.4 seconds. But then, something changed. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. You didn't just react. You executed a maneuver so complex, so dependent on precise timing and a deep understanding of 3 different quirks plus environmental physics, that it borders on precognition. You didn't just kick a car. You used it to create a blind spot for Todoroki that lasted exactly long enough for him to act. You couldn't have planned that. You didn't have time to communicate it. It was, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Aizawa paused, letting the word hang in the sterile air. It wasn't instinct, Midoriya. Instinct is reacting to what you see. You were reacting to things that hadn't happened yet. Your eyes, right before you collapsed, they weren't focused. They were darting around, tracking multiple points at once, as if you were seeing things that weren't there. So I'm going to ask you one more time. What is going on with you? This was it. The moment he had been dreading. He was cornered, his flimsy lies torn to shreds by Aizawa's sharp, analytical mind. He looked at his teacher, at the man who had sacrificed his own body to protect them, who valued logic and honesty above all else. Then he looked at All Might, his mentor, the man who had entrusted him with the world's greatest secret. The hope of generations. He could lie again. He could try to invent some plausible explanation about a new application of One for All, some kind of hyper-analytical state. But he knew, with a sinking certainty, that Aizawa wouldn't buy it. And the thought of lying to All Might's face, of hiding something so fundamental and terrifying from the man who had given him everything, felt like a profound betrayal. The secret was a cancer, and it was eating him alive from the inside out. The isolation was a crushing weight. He couldn't carry it alone anymore. The dam broke. A single, hot tear traced a path down his cheek, then another. A choked sob escaped his lips, a sound of pure, helpless despair. He hunched over, wrapping his arms around himself as if to hold his fragmenting psyche together. The carefully constructed walls of denial and defiance crumbled into dust. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words trembling. I'm so sorry. All Might was out of his chair in an instant, his large, bony hand coming to rest on Izuku's shoulder. The touch was grounding, a small point of warmth in his cold, terrifying world. My boy, All Might said, his voice thick with concern. Whatever it is, you can tell us. We are here to help you. Izuku took a deep, shuddering breath and looked up, his vision blurred with tears. He met Aizawa's intense gaze. It's a quirk, he began, the confession feeling like a physical weight being lifted from his chest. Or a part of One for All. I don't know. It started at the USJ during the training exercise. He told them everything. He started with the falling rebar, describing the sudden, overwhelming flood of visions. He explained the nature of the phenomenon, not one future, but every possible timeline that resulted in his death within the next hour, all experienced simultaneously. He described the paralysis, the sensory overload, the phantom pains of deaths he hadn't actually suffered. He told them about the night in the dorms, the terror of the staircase, the fear of his own lamp. He confessed to the experiment in the kitchen, holding the knife and deliberately triggering the visions, feeling the spike of pain in his head and the subsequent nosebleed. He pulled the black notebook from the small bedside table drawer where his belongings had been placed. His hands shook as he offered it to Aizawa. I started writing them down, he stammered. To try and understand it. To prove I wasn't going crazy. Aizawa took the notebook. His expression remained neutral, but Izuku could see a flicker of something in his eyes. Shock? Concern? He flipped through the pages, his gaze sweeping over the frantic scrawls, the detailed descriptions of death, the crude, shaky diagrams. He saw the title, Mortality Analysis for the Future. All Might leaned over to look, and a soft, pained gasp escaped his lips. He stared at the pages, at the clinical, horrifying catalogue of his successor's potential final moments. He looked from the notebook to Izuku's tear-streaked, terrified face, and his own eyes filled with a profound, aching sorrow. Izuku continued, his voice gaining a desperate momentum as the whole story poured out of him. He described them all, how the chaos had triggered the worst onslaught yet. He explained how he had tried to fight back not with his fists, but with his mind, treating the visions as data. I saw 237 ways to die, he said, his voice cracking. Every move I could think of, every move my friends could make, it all led to someone getting hurt, or me dying and failing. It was a puzzle, a horrible, impossible puzzle. The plan, the one that worked, it was the only one. The only path I saw where the villain was stopped, and no one was seriously injured. But to see it, I had to sift through all the others. He finally finished, his confession hanging in the silent room. He felt raw, exposed, like his skull had been opened up and his tormented thoughts laid bare for them to see. He slumped back against his pillows, utterly drained, waiting for the verdict. Would they pull him from the hero course? Declare him mentally unstable? A liability? He had a quirk that literally showed him how he was a danger to himself and others. He was a walking, talking weak point. For a long moment, there was only the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Aizawa closed the notebook with a soft thud. He set it down on the bedside table and scrubbed a hand over his tired face. The stoic mask had cracked, revealing the deeply weary man beneath. Aizawa-kun, All Might began, his voice low and strained. It's like Sir Nightai's quirk. Aizawa finished, his voice grim. But twisted. A dark reflection of it. Nightai saw one definite future path. Midoriya sees every possible fatal one. It's not foresight, it's fatal foresight. He looked at Izuku, and for the first time, Izuku saw not disappointment or clinical assessment, but a flicker of something that looked almost like empathy. No wonder you've been on edge. Living with that, it would be hell. The validation, the simple acknowledgement of his suffering, was so powerful it made Izuku choke on another sob. He wasn't just crazy. It was real. All Might sank back into his chair, his tall frame seeming to shrink. He looked devastated, his face a mask of guilt. My boy. I had no idea. One for all. It is a power that stockpiles not just energy, but the quirks of its previous users. We discovered that with Black Whip. This must be another one, a quirk from one of the vestiges, manifesting in you. He looked at his own skeletal hands. To pass this burden on to you, not just the power, not just the responsibility of being the symbol, but this curse. I am so sorry, young Midoriya, it's not your fault, All Might. Izuku whispered, shaking his head. You didn't know, but that doesn't change the reality of your situation. Aizawa cut in, his practical nature reasserting itself. He stood up and began to pace, his mind clearly working, processing the new, insane variable that had been introduced to his class. This changes things? Aizawa said, more to himself than to them. It explains your paralysis. It explains your impossible strategy. It also explains the physical toll. The brain isn't meant to process that volume of traumatic sensory input. The nosebleeds, the exhaustion, it's a form of extreme neural overload. If you keep using it like you did today, you'll suffer permanent neurological damage. You could have an aneurysm. A stroke. Izuku's blood ran cold. He had been so focused on the visions of violent death that he hadn't considered the possibility of the quirk itself simply killing him from the inside. So what do I do? Izuku asked, his voice small. Do I have to stop? Can I even be a hero? This was the core of his fear. That this power made him unfit. A liability whose very presence was a danger. He braced himself for the answer he dreaded, for Aizawa to tell him he was being benched, pulled from the course for his own safety. Aizawa stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. His expression was stern, but his eyes held a strange, new light. A fire Izuku hadn't seen there before. Stop? Aizawa said, a humorless smirk touching his lips. Midoriya, you just used this curse to neutralize a villain and save dozens of lives with zero significant casualties in a complex hostage situation. You turned a personal horror into a tactical advantage on a level I've never seen. You think I'm going to tell you to stop? Izuku stared at him, dumbfounded. That was the last thing he had expected to hear. This isn't a curse you need to be cured of. Aizawa continued, his voice gaining strength. It's a quirk. A powerful, dangerous, and incredibly taxing quirk. And like any other quirk, it needs to be trained, controlled, mastered. All Might looked from Aizawa to Izuku, a slow, dawning realization spreading across his face. He saw it then. The path forward. It wasn't a path of retreat or fear, but of confrontation. He stood up, his full height seeming to return, the weight of his guilt replaced by a surge of fierce, protective pride. He walked to Izuku's bedside and placed a hand on his shoulder again. Aizawa-sensei is right, All Might said, his voice resonating with the old, familiar power of the symbol of peace. I looked at this and I saw only the burden. The pain. But you, my boy, in the midst of all that horror, you found a way to use it. You faced down 200 of your own deaths and chose a path that saved everyone. He looked Izuku directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. You are not a liability. You are not broken. You are a hero, Izuku Midoriya. What you did today was not the act of someone who is unfit. It was the act of someone who is extraordinary. All Might's voice grew thick with emotion. Do you understand the courage that takes? It's one thing to run into a burning building. It is another thing entirely to have seen 100 ways that building can kill you, to feel the phantom agony of the flames, and to run in anyway. You are not just defying fate, my boy. You are staring it down in all its myriad, terrifying forms and choosing to walk the path of a hero anyway. That is true courage. The words washed over Izuku, a soothing balm on his raw, frayed nerves. He had been so consumed by the fear, the pain, the isolation, that he hadn't seen it that way. He hadn't seen the strength in what he'd done. He had only seen the cost. All Might and Aizawa, they weren't looking at him like he was a fragile, broken thing. They were looking at him like a soldier who had discovered a powerful, volatile new weapon. So, what now? Izuku asked, a fragile seed of hope beginning to sprout in the desolate landscape of his mind. Now we train, Aizawa said decisively. In secret. This is a strategic asset of unparalleled potential. No one else can know. Not your classmates, not even the other staff. The fewer people who know about your fatal foresight, the better. He started outlining a plan, his mind already formulating protocols and exercises. We need to establish a baseline. Understand the triggers. We know adrenaline and conscious intent are factors. We need to find out if you can activate it in a calm state. If you can control the scope. Can you focus on a single person? A single object? Can you filter the visions, tune out the low-probability death by slipping on a banana peel scenarios to focus on the immediate, high-probability threats? All Might nodded in agreement, his analytical mind, the one that had made him the one hero for so long, kicking into gear. The cost is the biggest issue. We need to find a way for you to use this without suffering neural damage. Perhaps short, controlled bursts. Scans, you could call them. Instead of letting the torrent run wild, you learn to open the floodgates for just a second, gather the necessary data, and then shut it down. We need to build up your mental stamina, Your psychological resilience. Izuku listened, his mind reeling. A moment ago, he had been drowning. Now, his two most trusted mentors were throwing him a lifeline, not by pulling him from the water, but by teaching him how to navigate the storm. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was no longer all-encompassing. It was now joined by a flicker of something else, purpose. He wasn't alone anymore. Okay, Izuku said, his voice stronger now, firmer. He sat up straighter, the foreline tugging at his hand. Okay. I'll do it. I'll train. Aizawa gave a sharp, satisfied nod. Good. Rest for now. Your training begins Monday. We'll use Gym Gamma. It's the most adaptable. We can create controlled chaos scenarios. He picked up the black notebook. And this? He said, tapping the cover. This is a good start. But we're going to change the methodology. This isn't just a journal of nightmares anymore. This is your most important piece of hero analysis equipment. Every time you have a vision, you document it. Triggers, duration, number of fatalities, physical and mental costs. We treat this like a science. We gather data, we form hypotheses, we test them. We turn your greatest fear into your sharpest weapon. He handed the notebook back to Izuku. It felt different in his hands now. It was no longer a heavy, morbid secret. It was a tool. A challenge. Aizawa and All Might stood to leave, giving him space to rest. As All Might reached the door, he paused and looked back, a gentle smile on his tired face. You know, my boy, he said softly. The path of a hero is never easy. Every single one of us has to face our fears. Yours are just a bit more vivid than most, but I have never been more proud of you than I am at this moment. He closed the door, leaving Izuku alone once more in the quiet of the infirmary. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a classroom after a difficult lesson, a space for thought and reflection. He looked at the black notebook in his lap. Fatal Foresight. Aizawa had given it a name. Naming it made it real, but it also made it something that could be defined, understood, and perhaps, one day, controlled. He picked up his pen and turned to a new, blank page. The headache was still there, a dull throb reminding him of the cost. The fear hadn't vanished. He knew the next time the visions came, it would be just as terrifying. But now, he had a mission. He had allies. He had hope. His hand was steady as he wrote the first entry of his new, guided research. Quirk name, Fatal Foresight, provisional. Subject, Midoriya Izuku. Mentors, Aizawa Shoyuda, Yagi Tashinori. Objective, mastery. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting back.